Welcome to the screencast for Egoism and Moral Skepticism by James Rachels. This can be found on page 356 in your textbook. There are a lot of assumptions that we take for granted when we think about morality and what it is. We assume that we have an obligation to be concerned with the welfare of others, a moral obligation. We think we have to refrain from harming other people, and we think we have to respect human rights. But we also have probably all encountered people that reject all of this, who claim that there's no such thing as true selflessness or true altruism. Now, when anybody does something for the benefit of others, at the root of that behavior is selfishness. So morality isn't real. They're moral skeptics. And we call those people moral egoists. We think we only behave morally because of social pressure or because helping others makes us selfishly feel better about ourselves. James Rachels, in our article for today, argues strongly against this view. Before we get started, there are two kinds of egoism: psychological egoism and ethical egoism. The first says that all behavior is selfish at its root, that there's no such thing as human behavior that is unselfish, and altruism doesn't exist. The second one, ethical egoism, says that it ought to be, regardless of whether or not it's true that all human behavior is selfish. It ought to all be completely selfish. So it's a pretty strong view. Rachels takes each one in turn and provides counter arguments. So first he points to an anecdote from Plato's Republic. Remember, Plato was writing in the 3rd and 4th century before the Common Era. And remember the structure of Plato's dialogues. There's a main speaker, and it's usually Socrates, who has interlocutors that bring up counter arguments and counter examples or points that need illustrating and defining, so Socrates can strengthen his own argument. Glaucon is one of those interlocutors in the Republic, which was a dialogue that built up Plato's idea of the perfect sort of society. He tells a story about the ring of Gyges, which was a mythological ring in ancient Greece that would make you invisible. So, of course, if you put this ring on and you became invisible, you could do whatever you want. And the story in the myth is that the man who got the ring went in, seduced the queen, killed the king, and seized power of the city-state. Glaucon asks Socrates, well, what if we had two rings, and we gave one of them to a virtuous person and one of them to a rogue or a non-virtuous person? What would happen? Glaucon thought that the two people would act exactly in the same way. That if there was no social pressure, they wouldn't care about the wishes or health or good of anybody else but themselves. They'd all take what they wanted absolutely selfishly. There's no incentive to be moral if there's no punishment. But if Glaucon and other moral skeptics are right, what we normally assume in morality, that we should not want to hurt other people and that we have a moral obligation to others and that human rights matter, that's all thrown into question. Morality is purely selfish, and it's like a skin that's floating on top of the real motivations of humanity. Rachel starts out by using an example to argue against the egoists. He says that a guy named Smith is about to go on his vacation. He's really looking forward to it. He really wants to go on his vacation. But his friend needs to study for an upcoming exam, and he can help him. So he stays home and helps his friend prepare for this exam. Now, the egoist has a couple of common arguments as to why Smith's behavior was ultimately selfish. And they usually fall into these two main kinds of arguments. That ultimately Smith or any agent is doing what they want to do ultimately. They might say they really wanted to go on the vacation, but really what won out is they wanted to stay home and help their friend. And the second one is that so-called unselfish actions always produce a sense of self-satisfaction in the person doing them. So Smith feels like a good friend because he stayed home to help his friend instead of going on his vacation. So to argue against one, Rachel explains that it doesn't matter what the person wants to do what they do. Because what really matters to morality is what sorts of things the agent wants. You can want something unselfish or you can want something selfish. So if what you want to do is to help somebody, your goal is unselfish. If what you want to do is make yourself feel good, then you're acting in a selfish manner. Furthermore, people do things that they don't want to do all the time. Sometimes it's selfishly motivated, like you go to work to get a paycheck. But sometimes it's not. The end is the goal of helping someone. So you might do something that you find incredibly tedious, like tutor somebody in a subject you find boring, but you know. But your goal is to help somebody else. So that's unselfish. In argument number 2, the egoist claims that helping others makes the agent feel good, and that's selfish. So the same counter-argument that was applied in 1, or a very similar counter-argument, can be applied in number 2. In order to get any sort of self-satisfaction from helping other people, you have to want to help people. So the people who help others get termed things like compassionate and good-hearted and kind and benevolent. And those are the people that are going to get self-satisfaction from helping others. If you don't have those character traits, helping others isn't going to give you any satisfaction whatsoever. You have to have the traits of kindness and compassion for it to matter one way or the other. And additionally, you don't get those feelings of self-satisfaction from just sitting around and thinking about helping somebody. You have to actually complete the goal. So the goal of helping others has to actually be fulfilled in order to get those feelings of self-satisfaction. And that in itself is also altruistic. So now that he's argued against these 2 common types of egoist arguments, he says that there are 3 common confusions or reasons as to why people fall for the trap of egoism. And they are when people confuse selfishness with self-interest, the assumption that all actions stem from either self-interest or other regarding motives, and the assumption that concern for one's own welfare is incompatible with any concern of the welfare of others. And Rachel thinks that once these confusions are cleared away, it seems obvious that there's no reason to accept psychological egoism. So let's look at number 1. When you confuse selfishness with self-interest, let's see where this is. On page 360. They're clearly not the same. And if when you see a doctor when you're feeling bad or you get food because you're hungry, you're tending to your self-interest, but nobody would call it selfishness. Selfishness already carries a moral judgment within it. Nobody, again, would say that you're being selfish because you have a job to pay your bills, to buy the food to keep you alive. When you say someone's selfish, you're not describing just their actions, you're condemning their actions. So, of course, there's another example where if you smoke cigarettes, you might be being selfish, but you're definitely not concerned with your self-interest, because your self-interest is to not smoke cigarettes because it causes illness. It's false that all actions are selfish, and it's false that all actions are done out of self-interest. So that sort of leads into number 2, wherein any sort of action can be both self-interested and other regarding at the same time. There's no reason to say that any action has to be one or the other. So if you go back to that Smith example where he stays home to help his friend for an upcoming exam, it can be self-interested if he knows he gets a sense of self-satisfaction from helping others, but he also cares about his friend and wants him to succeed. So he has both self-interest and other regarding motives. And now the third one is closely related. You can care for your own welfare and be concerned with the welfare of others. So there are lots of situations that don't have anything to do with you, and you can be concerned with other people. So when there are natural disasters, for example. And sometimes Rachel acknowledges that our interests conflict with the interests of others, and we'll have to make hard choices. But sometimes we still might opt for the interests of other people. Even when you have what Rachel calls the strongest self-regard, it doesn't have to stop you from acting considerately toward others. So if you clear away those three confusions, Rachel thinks psychological egoism is left in the dustbin. What about ethical egoism? So this position's even stronger than psychological egoism. Even if we act unselfishly sometimes, we ought not to do so. We have no moral obligation to anyone, and to say otherwise is a naive fiction. It's a really strong point of view that some people hold. I think Rachel's points to Ayn Rand in the footnotes. And he then says, of course, the common view is that the ethical egoist will still obey rules, laws, and norms of society, at least outwardly. And he points a little bit, also in the footnotes, to the social contract, which when we get to the justice section in our syllabus, we'll talk about in a lot more detail. But for now, all you need to know is that human beings flourish better under the rule of law and under a government. Because if you think about total freedom, where we could do whatever we wanted, no rule of law, no government, everyone's going to be striving for whatever they want. It's this ultimate egoist paradise, the state of nature, war of all against all. Everybody would be vulnerable at all times. You would try to amass resources or wealth, and anybody could come and steal it or kill you and take it, because there's no rule of law. So when we give up a little bit of our freedoms, in return for safety, security, and consistency, everybody can flourish more. We can build businesses. We can gather and accumulate wealth. Whereas if we didn't have these rules that applied to everybody, we would be back in that state where we could be killed, or all of our wealth could be taken at any moment. We get a stable environment in return. So it's in every rational person's advantage to submit to this social contract. Rachel says if you're a real ethical egoist, you don't actually have to submit to this. You have to pretend you do. You have to convince other people that you're going to respect their wishes and not harm them. But you really want in private to be advocating for your personal benefit at all times, because you have zero obligation to anybody. You would need other people to keep being altruists, because if everybody was, in game theory they call it defecting, if everybody was trying to manipulate everybody else, that social contract would collapse. But if you're really a rational person and you're really advocating selfishly for only your own benefit, your own best interests, you would want everybody to be altruistic except for you. One common argument against ethical egoism is logical and rational in nature, and it's given by the rule of law, the logical rule of non-contradiction. So if you're inconsistent, if you're logically inconsistent from a rational point of view, your argument can never hold up. The law of non-contradiction says something can't be and not be at the same time. You can't have A and not A. Something can't be red and not red at the same time. But Rachel doesn't think this works to refute ethical egoism, because again, you want everyone else to act in one way while you advocate your own personal interests. Rachel thinks the real refutation of this theory isn't logical at all. It's based on these fundamental moral assumptions that most of us have in place. And first, you have to acknowledge that if an egoist isn't going to acknowledge normal moral rules, there's no further way that you can argue. It's the same in other domains of thought. If you want to rationally argue against something, but other people don't acknowledge the importance of evidence or reasoning, you're at an impasse. You just have to let go of the argument with that particular party. I'm going to end this with two long quotes that I think sum up pretty powerfully why the ethical egoist still loses. On page 363, he says, "The reason one ought not to do actions that would hurt other people is that other people would be hurt. The reason one ought to do actions that would benefit other people is because other people would be benefited." This may at first seem like a piece of philosophical sleight of hand, but it is not. The point is that the welfare of human beings is something that most of us value for its own sake, and not merely for the sake of something else. So he's saying in here that we value other people for their own sakes. That sounds a little reminiscent of Kant, but it's true. We care about people automatically, and that sort of goes back to health. There is no individual that is completely isolated from everyone else in every single way. Our view of the rational rugged individualist is the actual fiction, wherein most of us care about others naturally. We value people for their own sake. We don't want to hurt them. And then he goes on page 364 to say, when the egoist says that he doesn't accept that as a reason, that being not harming other people, he's saying something quite extraordinary. He's saying that he has no affection for his friends or family, that never feels pity or compassion, that he's the sort of person who can look upon the scenes of human misery with complete indifference, so long as he is not the one suffering. And Rachel continues that we shouldn't overlook how deep sympathy, empathy, and caring are part of the human psychological makeup, and that the people who are true egoists are few and far between, and sometimes we barely see them as human beings whatsoever. So there might not be a rational counter-argument against ethical egoism, but there is a human one.